Good afternoon. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you, Jairo, for inviting me. It's a really great pleasure being here. The title is slightly different from the one my talk has been advertised. Obviously, what I'm going to talk about is what lies behind the news of the decline of the United States of America. If you pick up any magazine, foreign policy magazine, economics magazine in this country or abroad, then you will see the debate, a debate is going on, whether or not the United States is in decline. What do we mean by that? I'll tell you in a minute. But before we look at what lies behind the decline of the United States, we better have a look at first what defines or used to define the strength of the United States of America. It's impossible, of course, to look at the factors that defined the might, the strength of the United States if we don't go back a little bit into history, and in particular in the history that begins with the end of the Second World War, which in fact these are the years, the 40s are the years which established the United States as a predominant actor in global politics. Not that it wasn't an important actor before that, but in the 40s it becomes the #1 power of the Western, let me use the word, capitalist world. Okay? Now, so therefore, the first part of my talk defines the contours of US global strategy since the Second World War, and the second part explores the changing dynamics of global politics and economics today, a dynamics that set off in a very interesting decade, the 60s. What I will be arguing is that from the 60s onwards, the decade that actually marked with the Vietnam War, from then onwards we have a protracted, slow, very slow, but constant decline of the United States of America, primarily in economics. Yeah? The economic might of the United States, primarily. From the 60s onwards, I want to keep that in mind very well. Now, the key pillars of the US grand strategy, as I would call it, after the Second World War, but even before that, in one respect, are as follows. The first, I would call it open door strategy. Okay? Open door is a concept that was promulgated by American policymakers and presidents themselves in 1890s. And what is open door? This is very important. The classic text for open door policy, US open door policy, is that by William Appleman Williams, a historian who wrote a fantastic book in 1959, maybe a bit in the 50s anyway, no, maybe not 1959, The Tragedy of American Diplomacy. Now, what does this book say? This book says that American foreign policy basically is based on the open door principle, that all other markets of the world has to be as open as the United States market, must be free from state interference, and those markets, the freer these markets are, the more conducive will be to receive US produce in their own sphere. So it's not good news for the United States if you have a guy called Saddam Hussein who says, I'm not going to let US foreign companies or oil companies enter the Iraqi oil market because I want to protect my own market and I want the oil to be used for the interests of the Iraqi state. The United States opposes this policy of closure and argues for a policy of open door. This is a permanent feature, I want to repeat that, a permanent feature of US grand strategy since 1890s. 1890s, not 1990s, 1890s. So from then till to the present day, open door strategy means that if, and the perception developed within the minds of American policy-making elites, is that if the door is not open to American multinational companies, to American products, American commodities, to American financial products as well, derivatives, CS, CDS, credit default swap, all type of products, real or surreal, You know, a CDS is a derivative is a surreal product. There is no real value in there. Nobody worked. No worker worked to produce a derivative, right? Or futures, or all sort of things. So if the global market, if every state does not have the market open to American product, this is bad news for the United States, and in some cases maybe even an act of war, if you see what I mean. Okay, because this is linked to an American security and security complex. Because if the other countries do not have a democracy and a free market that resembles the American democracy and the American market, then this is a security issue for the United States. This makes US policymakers to feel and say that we are under threat. Okay? So therefore, the other markets have to be open in order for us to be secure back at home. Okay? This is the fundamental perception, I would say, strategic culture of the US policymaking elites, from the 1890s to the present day as I'm speaking to you right now. However, from the Second World War onwards, we have a number of qualifications regarding this position, not least because one part of the world had been closed off as the markets of the East, the markets that were defined by the predominance of the Soviet Union. So therefore you could not have open door there. But you could have open door in two other important markets of the world, and that was the Western European markets and Japan and Southeast Asia on the other. And the way in which the United States put forth a new kind of strategy based on open door but qualifying open door requirements is that what I call, in my previous book that Jairo mentioned, is what I call hub and spoke system of global governance. What is hub and spoke? I want you to pay a little bit of attention here. What is hub and spoke? Hub and spoke means that the center of decision making is Washington, D.C., and all other parts of the capitalist world are dependent spokes of that hub, if you see what I mean. And how do we achieve that? We can achieve that by creating NATO, which institutionalizes the dependence of West European politics upon Washington, D.C., and via bilateral treaties, like the treaty with Japan in 1950, which was, if you read that treaty, I don't know, I can see some of you, most of you are Asians, if you read that treaty, it's on the internet, Google it and read it, the US-Japanese treaty in 1950, you will see what a kind of humiliating document Japan signed in 1950. It's really humiliating. It's a treaty that sanctions, endorses, establishes the domination, political and military domination of Japan by the United States. So therefore, this is the hub and spoke model of global governance that the United States establishes after the Second World War, and in a way, it did so in order to avoid the old type of inter-imperialist, as Lenin would call it, contradictions which led to the First and the Second World War. Okay? Instead of having rival imperial powers, France on the one hand, Britain on the other hand, Italy, Germany, and their conflicting interests around the globe, you know, breaking out into wars all the time, the United States said, no, the world is mine. Remember Al Pacino in the movie? The world is yours. You want to become big. You know, this is American dream. So therefore, by establishing that type of global governance, the United States could A, be number one in the world all the time, achieving primacy in global affairs, and B, avoiding at the same time being proud to say, go around and say, look, we have no world wars anymore because France and the Germans are now friends under the European Union, and above the European Union it's us that guarantees the security of the European Union. After all, not least because we have 50,000 US soldiers permanently stationed in Germany. Yeah? And the soldiers, US soldiers, are still there with all the nukes and everything, and haven't gone back home after the end of the Cold Cold War. So the Soviet Union disappeared, but NATO did not disappear. The Warsaw Pact disappeared, but NATO did not disappear. Conclusion: it means that NATO was not formed in order to achieve let me rephrase. NATO was not formed having as a main enemy the Soviet Union, but basically primarily to achieve primacy via hub-and-spoke arrangements in Western Europe and secondarily in Japan. Although NATO is not in Japan, but that I said is bilateral. This is arranged by bilateral treaties. The second thing perhaps you would be interested a bit more, which defined US global strength, it has to do with an ideational scheme, what in international relations we call ideational element, upon which a lot of stuff regarding the relatively new theory of international relations coming from, and we call it constructivism. It's full of this sort of this sort of elements. The ideational element in U.S. grand strategy, it has to do with the global war on communism. Okay, the global war on communism was not just a war on the Soviet Union, but at the same time it forced all Western states, including Japan, all Western states to adopt this anti-communist agenda. Each state had an anti-communist clause within its constitution or other kind of laws. Germany, for example, had a clause, the so-called Berufsverbot, which disallowed any member of the Communist Party of Germany to get a job in the public sector as a civil servant. It's still around. Germany did not get rid of this clause, but now this clause includes those who are suspected of terrorism. The final and fundamental, I would say fundamental, I left it the last one, but in fact is the number one. The final fundamental element which gave the United States such a big strength after the Second World War is the primacy, is hub-and-spoke economics, to put it in a different way, is the primacy of the dollar as the global reserve currency in global currency markets. Okay? What does it mean? It means that every country, in order to trade, has to have reserves in dollars. So you have to buy dollars from the United States in order to trade with the United States and the rest of the world. And this has been established in the so-called Bretton Woods agreements in 1944, where it pegged the dollar against the gold, where $35 are equivalent to 1 ounce of gold, and this defined the global trade and the international political economy. Again, dollar as the primary reserve currency in global economy. Now, so far so good. Yeah, these principles worked very well and established the U.S. hegemony in the Western world from 1945 through to the 60s, with some problems, but overall this gave an enormous boost in global economics, in development, in growth. It was behind the golden age, the so-called golden age of capitalism, what the French call the trend glorieuse, you know, the 20, 30 years of massive economic growth in terms of GDP, and also of almost nearly full employment in the Western world. Inflation was minimal, and so on and so forth. But something happened. I'm not going to go into details to that, but something happened in the 60s, and this kind of strategy of the United States has begun to falter. Yeah. From the late 50s and early 60s, the U.S. balance of payments had moved into persistent deficit. I don't know if you understand this. Balance of payment has to do with trade. It means that the U.S. basically imported more than it exported to the world. And that means that it added on its debt. All great powers in history have been creditor powers. Bear this in mind. Creditor powers. They had credit. They had a lot of money. They put a lot of money in the reconstruction of Europe and Japan after the Second World War. They had money. The United States. The Marshall Plan, the Marshall Aid in Europe. A lot of money. Now, from the late 60s, the US began becoming a debtor power. No money. Today, the debt, the total debt of the United States is 100%. You know what it means? It means that if $16 trillion is its GDP, $16 trillion is its debt. And if we take the what Merkel said recently, that no country with over 80% debt over its GDP can be fully independent, then yes, I agree with Merkel. The United States is not totally sovereign today in that respect. It's also dependent on China because the Chinese buy a lot of treasury bills and then help refinance US debt. But what's going to happen if the Chinese withdraw these holdings in treasury bills from the US Treasury? Then it's going to be a mess, a havoc. That's why perhaps the United States keeps all its military presence and bases around China, yeah, to exercise military pressure on the Chinese. I just want to give you some data, how the dollar-gold parity has been undermined from 60s onwards. Gold, as I said, dollar was pegged to the gold. Okay, the gold was the standard value against which dollar was measured, and against the dollar all other currencies were measured. You can see that in 1953 the USA had 20,000 metric tons of gold, and Europe and France, I'll explain in a minute why I say France, 4,840. In 1967 it dropped by half. I think this is a serious, very serious indication of how the economic base, the material base of the United States and henceforth of the dollar had begun eroding. Okay, and then Europe and France rose up to 18,064. I say France because de Gaulle was the first politician who realized that by having to buy dollar in global currency markets, especially from the United States, this is a mechanism of financing indirectly America's war venture in Vietnam. This is how beautiful. You have the French workers working hard producing, you have France buying dollars from the United States in global currency markets, but the unequal value of the dollar in European and American markets was giving the US the advantage because of this ignorance to finance its war venture in Vietnam. So therefore, de Gaulle pursued a strategy of buying gold instead of buying dollars from the United States, if you see what I mean. So by start buying gold, it undermined the parity, the 1 ounce of gold, $35 a pound. It undermined the parity established in Bretton Woods. And France is the key responsible for, if you like, the erosion of the Bretton Woods system. Another indicator of the decline of the US, this has to do with global competition. I mean, one of the tragedies of the United States is, whereas it helped rebuild Japan and Western Europe after the Second World War, at the same time, German capitalism and Japanese capitalism reinvented themselves, recreated themselves with the economic miracles of the 50s and 60s began again. They formed consortia and business that were competing directly with those of the United States. And this global competition between Japan during the Cold War, Japan, Germany, and the United States induced the falling of the rates of profit in industry, especially in American manufacturing. And if we accept this is an argument I take directly from Robert Brenner, who's a professor of political economy and economic history at UCLA, and I'm convinced by this argument that if the driving force behind a capitalist enterprise is how to make profits, and if the profits go down, then obviously capitalism as a whole, that enterprise in particular, has problems. Okay? Now, let me move on to another issue. Of course, there are people who disagree with what I'm saying. I mean, I had at Richmond University the other day a professor from York University, Leo Panich, I don't know if you heard him, as a big name in Canada, from Canada, who says, well, all this doesn't mean anything. The US continues to be a predominant economic power, political power in the globe, and so on and so forth. It is a matter of methodology and interpretation. My interpretation is the one I'm giving you now. You can also look at this macroeconomic, macro-historical aggregates of the US economy. It is very telling because, for example, in 1951, the United States had 6% of total world population, and this accounted for 40% of the global GDP. Now, by 1980, the US share dropped to 22%. Okay, I think this is significant. It means that the manufacturing base of the United States has been eroding constantly, slowly but constantly, and so therefore the US economy stopped somehow producing real use values. I use the terminology of classical economy, of classical economists, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and Marx, if you like. Use values. They stopped producing use values. Check your jumpers, check your whatever you wear, and you see made in Taiwan, made in China, made in wherever else, but not the United States. Even this jacket I have here is from Vietnam. They call it so Vietnam. It says made in Taiwan. I bought it from the United States, from a military store. It says made in Vietnam. This is made in Vietnam. So manufacturing, therefore, has been shifting. And look at this. Once manufacturing was made in the USA, now it dropped to 25%. And then outsourcing. This is very important. 58 shifts of production sites from the US to China, 55 from the European Union to China, and 33 from other Asian countries to China. It's obviously, if you cannot make profits in the United States, you go somewhere you can find cheap labor and favorable taxation regimes. This is very obvious, doesn't it? However, the United States responded to that crisis of manufacturing and industrialism. And the 70s, you're very young, you were not even born to remember, but the 70s was a huge crisis in this country in particular. This country, there was no lights, there were blackouts. And so the huge crisis, the so-called stagflation, which is stagnation accompanied by high inflation, fiscal crisis of the states, and so on. And how did the United States respond to that crisis is very peculiar, very interesting. The United States responded to this crisis by moving to what we call financialization, the creation of fictitious commodities. In the 90s, Clinton called it globalization. I'm afraid to say that from my own political economy perspective, what we call globalization is basically financialization. That is the use of extraordinary or very extreme financial instruments in order to produce a kind of fictitious type of growth. Look at the statistics. They are very misleading, actually. Many statistics are very misleading, especially from the 90s onwards, because they give high GDP growth, 6-7%. Greece, before it was forced to seek a bailout, had 6% GDP growth. What happened? Overnight, the economy collapsed? No, it did not. It was not like that. This 6% GDP growth was basically a growth driven by debt. It was borrowed money. It was borrowed money. If a statistician, if I buy a house in this country, okay, if I buy a house and I buy it £250,000, say, right? I buy a house of £250,000. I pay only £50,000 deposit. Now, if a statistician puts the £200,000 into its statistic as kind of because I owe this money and one day I will give this money, right? If he puts it into the statistics as a kind of developmental element, then the statistics will appear that have, GDP will appear very high. But in fact, it's my debt. Because if I lose my job, Richmond University, I won't have money to pay the mortgage. So who's going to, this is debt. So it's paper. That's what it is. It's paper. So therefore, be careful when how you read statistics. Financialization is a very funny undertaking and a very precarious undertaking once you began playing with bubbles and when you securitize in that respect. So financialization is a major vulnerability. It's not a sign of strength, as Leo Panich and others say, Marxists and non-Marxists. It doesn't make any difference. Financialization is a major vulnerability of the United States, which can hardly replace the stable model of Bretton Woods fixed exchange rates regime. Okay? This is one reason why the United States is weak, why this is one reason, it is one factor what lies behind the weakness of the United States and the slow decline of the United States as an economic superpower. But we have also to look at the other domains I mentioned, the political, what happened to hub and spoke arrangements, and the ideational. I think here we have to keep an eye on what's happening at the European level. And we have to say a few things about the European crisis. Because if Europe explodes, and it is very likely to explode. I had the chat the other day with a key financial editor of Financial Times, Martin Wolf. I don't know if you know him, but he writes almost every day in Financial Times. And I asked him, do you think the euro will survive the crisis? And he said to me, 50-50. That's my answer. 50-50. Can you imagine? If the Europe explodes, if the euro goes bust, then this is not good news for the United States. I'll come back to that if you have in the question and answer sessions. But here I want to say a few things about the European crisis. The whole European project was badly done from the beginning. It was very badly put together from the beginning. They started creating a common market and introduced a common currency without having a state to back that currency. Where in history do we have such an example? There is no historical precedent. Even in ancient Egypt, when they were introducing these huge currencies, you know, the stones and stuff, they had a state. The Egyptians had first, before the Greeks understood what's happening with that aspect of monetary policy. So you need a state to guarantee the problems you may have out of a monetary union. This is a typical. It's an IMF from an IMF database which shows the imbalances in the eurozone. It's very obvious to have imbalances in the eurozone. The German economy is not the same with the Greek economy. The Greek economy is a very weak economy. Okay, when the American South united with the American North after the Civil War, then the American North, the industrial North, has written off all the debts of the South. Okay, now something similar, I suppose, has to happen in the European Union in order to survive. If Germany, but who will accept that? This is a different question we can discuss. If the Europeans want to unite, there is only one way to unite under Germany's supremacy. And then Germany will write off the debts of the periphery. Portugal, Spain, Italy, Greece, and Ireland. That's the only way to do it. Don't take me wrong, I'm the last person on earth to be suspected of being pro-German and so on, but it's the only way to do it because it's the strongest economy. And I will show you again now here, look at this with a current account balance, where you can see all the, Estonia entered recently the thing, you can see all these periphery countries having, even France has problems. Even France is so again, we enter into the debt trap of the European Union. And Germany, did what it did. They knew what they were doing, but they needed the consumer markets of the South. So they were lending money to the South, to the periphery, and the periphery was living on borrowed money. You had Greeks buying BMW. Every family had 3 BMW cars. but they were all borrowed. Okay? Again, GDP, very high, but this was debt. Yeah, the Greeks, the Spaniards, they were living on borrowed money. Okay, and the Germans knew what they were doing. Another source of debt, just to talk a little bit about the Greek crisis, is the defense spending. In 2010 2011, Greece bought 5 luxurious supersonic submarines from Germany. How come? And the Germans lent money. You know how they bought it? You think the Greeks gave cash? No, they issued debt. They issued bonds, paper. That's what, and then it adds on the Greek debt, and they continue, they keep things going on, and the discussions, and then people pay austerity and so on. People at the end will foot the bill. The problems we have now at the political level of the hub and spoke. Thank you. I'm okay. The problems we have at the political level. To what extent the United States can, or the primacy of the United States can endure in this messy world, is a very, very big problem. It's a question. It's a big question. NATO expands eastwards, right? But you see, it stops short of Russia. I mean, can Russia ever become a member of NATO? I highly doubt it. Well, China will become a member of NATO. This is impossible. And the first guy who said that the expansion of NATO is problematic was Kissinger. The expansion of NATO undermines the cohesion of NATO. You know, the expansion of NATO undermines the cohesion. So therefore, hub and spoke system, the hub and spoke system of neo-imperial, call it governance, has serious problems. Not to mention the tragedy the United States and Britain are experiencing in Afghanistan or in Iraq. In Iraq already gone. It's a major defeat. In Afghanistan, I mean, look, I was reading the other day on the newspapers, probably because you're in the journalist department, I was reading a newspaper, Metro newspaper, you know, on the tube in London. A rogue soldier, or Afghani, killed a British soldier as they were playing football. Yeah? They were playing football and was killed. So, you know, there's no security really in Afghanistan, anywhere in Afghanistan or in Iraq. So therefore, these ventures proved also unsuccessful. I'm coming down to the last, if you like, peg of the US strength, which was the ideational element. As I said, ideational element during the Cold War was the famous war on communism. This peg has been replaced by the war on terror. You know? Now, how convincing is for the average, now not kind of university educated, but you know, secondary school education, how convincing is to say somebody, you know, in Britain here, we are sending our soldiers to Afghanistan and to catch bin Laden. I'm not sure it's very convincing. It was more convincing to say we are still here in Europe, in Germany, because the Soviets will invade you. That, it was more convincing. But the war on terror is not convincing. And Obama, to his credit, understood that. The vocabulary, the discourse, the Obama's discourse does not mention war on terror very much. Watch his speech in Cairo he gave 3 years ago. It was very good. They dropped it almost. But they introduced legislation which undermines civil and human rights. They introduced Patriot Act. And again, same as in the Cold War era, you had all this anti-terrorist, counter-terrorist legislation inserted into the constitutive elements of, institutional elements of each Western polity. I mean, Greece has introduced anti-terrorist legislation, Italy has introduced anti-terrorist legislation, so it's a kind of pattern is repeated. Okay, again, it means that the US is still predominant, it's still the power that controls major chunks of the world, okay, but it is in a kind of disintegration. It was not as it used to be, not least because, I repeat, is a debtor power. Okay, this is, many call it an imperialism without credit. Many authors that I read and so on. Imperialism without credit. They don't have power. What they have, though, is the dollar. And the reason why they still have the dollar is because the dollar is backed by the American state. European Union does not have a state to back the euro. There's no such a thing. Okay? That's why it may go bust overnight. Especially if one member states of the European Union having problems, such as Greece, you know, defaults and exits the Eurozone. Default and exit of Greece, it is something which I supported, is not happening so far, but it may happen overnight. All it takes is the Prime Minister of Greece to go on the telly and say, we cannot make it. We have to introduce exchange controls, we have to introduce drachma now because we cannot make it. It's very simple, okay? And it seems to me that they cannot make it. So let me now wrap up our, what I've said. What lies behind the news of the decline of the US? Okay? I believe that the fundamental reason is the inability of the US to regain its industrial power. 2, 3 months, 4 months, 6 months before the election, Obama was going on and on, going around the country, let's rebuild our manufacturing base. I mean, he tries hard. He understands the problem. I believe that I believe that it's impossible for the US to regain its manufacturing and industrial strength. And here is my fundamentalism, and I accept the criticism. My fundamentalism is that if power lies where real values are produced, then power has shifted to where real values are produced, and this is Asia. This is the East. Okay? Now, the strength of the United States today is the fact that it controls financial market, and the dollar is still the world money, the world currency, the global reserve currency. Okay? Was the euro a threat to the dollar? Yes and no. The euro could have been potentially a threat to the dollar if you had the European federal state. Okay? But this is something the United States will never allow to happen. This is another problem they have. So therefore, they're in a big mess. The entire West is in a big mess. The European Union, the euro can survive only if you have a European state, but the Americans do not want to have a European state because the euro will become a serious rival to the dollar. Because if the Chinese start investing in the euro, then the scenario of what I mentioned earlier, all the treasury bills will be taken there, will be invested into Eurobonds, then that will be the end of the US supremacy. In the recent meeting in Laos, probably you've read that, it was all over the news. And the recent meeting in Laos between Asian leaders and European leaders, a meeting which Merkel did not attend. Yeah. Basically, you had Hollande, the French president, begging for money the Chinese to bail out the European Union. That was the meeting about. That was it all about. Okay. So, therefore, as I said, what lies also behind the news of the decline of the US is the volatility of the Eurozone. If the Eurozone goes bust, you will have a major problems concerning the security of the European Union, NATO expansion, and so on and so forth. That is a big, because one of the sources that finances NATO in Brussels and everywhere is euro resources, basically, euro denominated resources, and it goes without saying at the same time that hub and spoke arrangements are not going to be working. So therefore, the entire architecture upon which the United States has built its strength since the Second World War is now collapsing, disintegrating in front of everybody's eyes. And I will stop here. I think I haven't abused my time or your time. So.
We have time for questions, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of them, a lot of provocative thoughts there, and I think the students are very engaged now. Over there?
How do you see nowadays the relationship between the US and the Latin American countries? Because we all know the history that they have towards Cuba and Venezuela, but nowadays, how do you see that in terms of their politics?
Well, I think that what is rising is what we call globalist. By globalist, we mean not only China and Russia, but or Indonesia and India, but also Brazil, also countries in Latin America. I think that there's a changing relationship, and in fact, if the United States is about to lose its hegemony in the Western world, at the same time, the United States will have to reconsider its relationship with Latin American countries, because the United States, I remind you, established its hegemony first in the so-called Western Hemisphere, right? Now, everything is up in the air, in my view, although still maintains its grip on all Latin American countries, including Venezuela, I think, right?
Yeah.
A lot of what you were talking about is manufacturing in the US, but would you not say that we live in a post-industrialized in the West? We went through manufacturing and we've sort of come out the other side now. And while yes, manufacturing is shifted to China, that's largely consumer goods that we then import here. Yeah. But the US and Europe are still the biggest arms manufacturers and the biggest arms industry. Yeah. So while some stuff has shifted that way, I think. And also,
but also the copyrights still belong to the United States and West Europe.
The intellectual sort of industry is still in the West. So I think from what you said there, it seems slightly skewed.
Yeah. Okay. Good question. Thank you. I don't disagree with you. The US hasn't only kept this copyright, intellectual things and stuff, as you said, but also the US is still strong in pharmaceutical industry, and in defense industry. I'm not denying this. Nanotechnology and so on still has the lead. The Chinese hasn't produced Microsoft. Okay, this is a US product. This is a great strength. What I'm saying is that the decline is relative, and you have the rise of other powers too. And this is the contradictions, and I still, a system which is called capitalism. I believe it is capitalism. Unlike one of the authors, like Duncan Smith, who published an interview in New Left Review recently. I mean, you read it. He says this is not capitalism. What you've just described, basically, this is not capitalism. It's called creditism. Because everybody needs a credit. Everybody has a credit card. Everybody, it's credited. But it is not like that. What I'm trying to lay out here, to say to you, is that that's fine. We moved into service sector. We moved into financialization. We moved to all that. But this is my fundamentalism. I might be wrong, but this is what I believe, and I argued my work. I believe that the real power lies where real values are produced. Real values. Everything is manufacturing. Tell me what is not manufacturing in this building. The rest is paper, services. I work. I mean, what do I produce? What do we produce? No, I'm not saying because they're going to take the wages down. But do you try to understand my philosophy? So not that the US is not producing. Don't take me wrong. It does, but not as it used to be, because it shifted. Production, real value production, has shifted. And the tragedy is that the United States helped those countries to rebuild. They want to have capitalism. They wanted the Soviet Union to become capitalist. But look, now Putin plays hard to get. Look at Putin now has an enormous power in terms of regulating the gas market in the world. It's not controlled by the difference between in the past, in the 80s, was the debate that Japan is going to overtake the United States. Remember that? I mean, if you don't remember again, I'm sorry. I mean, the older. It didn't happen. It was wrong assumption. But I think now with China, India, Russia, and all and the rest, it's not the same. Not least because the United States does not control the security and the geopolitics of China and Russia. Whereas in Japan, everything is American. Go in Okinawa and you will see all US bases there. So therefore, your question is right. You're right to doubt what I said, but if you look at the big picture, then you will see that there is a power shift. If there is no power shift, and if we don't admit that there is a possibility of this period we're going through to be called as a power shift, then we have no instruments to advance a transition theory and transition hegemonic theory from one empire to another, unless if we admit that the American empire is the end of history. That I don't believe. It's very historical. I don't believe in that. I think something is happening.
I'll just give a word.
I suppose as an American who carries debt, so I fit your model quite well. But I'm curious if this is almost a discussion of what should be the decline of America rather than what will be. Because so theoretically, mathematically, it all looks like this is the writing on the wall. But when silver and gold became sort of a non-viable way to base a currency, you basically start basing it on numbers and prestige and saying we're the U.S., we'll back our money. And so if that starts to falter, they'll come up with a new device to sort of perpetuate either power or exceptionalism. There's always a way to sort of wiggle out of it. We, as if I'm all of the U.S., but that's what I see as the next step, not a decline, but a new way of justifying strength.
I'm sure they're trying to find a way out, like they found a way out of the crisis, from the crisis of industrialization by going to finance. Look back into history, because I'm always go back to history to find answers to what's happening now. When Marx was writing Das Kapital, he had in front of him the industry of Manchester. Yeah. No major credit institutions existed at the time. In 1890s, when Marx was dead, in 1890s, you had the first crisis of what he predicted in Das Kapital, the crisis of the so-called overaccumulation. Big crisis in industry. Falling rates of profits, the produce could not be sold, and so on and so forth. How did the elites at the time, particularly British elites, because there was a dominant power, respond to that crisis? By going to finance. Compare the crisis of 1929, which was a crisis of the collapse of the credit system, with a crisis which started in 2007. You will find so many similarities. Oh my God. The only complexity is that nowadays, because capitalism, because of the technology, computerization, and so on, is so much more integrated, that's the only difference. Other than that, you had a collapse of the housing market in 1929. You did have a collapse of the housing market. Read Hobsbawm. You have all the problems. You had securitization, collapse, banks were closing. So therefore, any time capitalism experiences a problem in its industrial sector, it moves to financialization. And then the bubble bursts, the bubble pops, okay? And then to go where? Now in 1929, you had a very clever man at Cambridge University. 1936 saw the interest, the theory, the general theory of interest, money, and employment, John Maynard Keynes. And this guy suggested that the problem is the aggregate demand. We must have the state intervene into economic affairs, boosting employment, and giving free education, free health system. What do the governments at present do in the United States, Britain, and the Eurozone? They deepen neoliberalism and financialization. They don't go back to the state. They want to deepen, and I think they are digging their holes. I think they're digging their graves. There is no possibility, for example, Greece, to afford all this austerity. You have no idea. My father's pension is 350 euros a month. If he was living in Athens, he wouldn't be able to make it. I would have to finance him. But he lives in a village, he grows vegetables, he goes fishing. That's how they do it. There are soup kitchens in Athens. Yeah? There are street clinics because hospitals cannot cope with emergencies. It's a mess. And they keep introducing austerity after. This is not gonna, they cannot, and in this country too, slowly. They do it, the same thing they do. They do the same thing, but they do it slowly. So therefore, of course they try to invent new instruments to get out of the crisis, but I think these new instruments, where are they? They are the same. They're the same.
Another question over there.
I kind of take it off that I doubt your thesis as bad as it actually is for the US, because you talk about adding kind of real value to product and everything else. The problem is that to create product you need the raw materials, and China, or BRIC countries basically have been investing massively in kind of raw resources in, like, particularly China and Africa with oil and everything else. So how do you kind of factor that in? Isn't it a lot worse for the US than you actually say when they haven't even got access to natural resources now?
Okay. Yes and no. It's not worse than that, because the US has, I mean, look at, for example, why you think the US went to Iraq. I believe the US went to Iraq not because of oil, but because he wanted to control the supplies of oil. I've done a paper on that, and I looked at the US oil requirements, domestic requirements. The US gets 18% of its domestic requirements from the Persian Gulf, 18%. But Europe gets 68%, China 80%, and so therefore the major other powers, Japan 70%, and so on. So therefore, by going to the Gulf, it was a problem. It was about oil security for the United States and ensuring that the oil will be traded in dollars, and therefore you determine the price of oil. And if you want to create an oil spike to damage the Japanese economy, the European economy, you could do it. There is a lot of bibliography that the 1973 oil crisis was artificially manufactured. It was manufactured by the United States. It was not something that OPEC took a decision because it wanted to think. But this is a long story. So, yeah.
I was going to make a couple of points about China, but then I realised majority here, so I won't make any comments about China. I'm not exactly authority on China compared to people here. But I was going to ask you a random question about some of the history you said. You said about de Gaulle being the first to recognise about the gold, and that US were using, is aiding their dollars for the Vietnam War. Does that have any bearing, de Gaulle's attitude, have any bearing on France's, well, they got kicked out basically of Vietnam. Does that have any bearing on that?
Kicked out from where? From NATO?
No, Vietnam, at that time.
Oh, no, they're unrelated, I think. They're unrelated.
So just they didn't want...
Yeah, no, they're unrelated. The French couldn't cope in Vietnam. Couldn't cope. The US in the end couldn't cope.
So I want to go back to the oil in France.
Yeah.
Dominating the supply of the oil, so the oil in the world. So the United States of America is now controlling most of the supply of oil in most parts of the world.
Big element of strength, yes.
Yeah. You said that they rely more on defense industry and intellectual industry, and they're manufacturing this war and wars between countries that are near each other, and this also guarantee that they will continue to sell weapons, and the Gulf is the biggest example for that, and this is also a strength that the United States still have in hand. And also, what about how big an import market they would be? So China is the biggest exporter to the United States, but equivalence to that is that the United States is the biggest market for the Chinese industry or whatever they are manufacturing, and this also is a strength to the United States.
Yes, I agree. I don't disagree with any of this. I don't disagree. But the thing is to see whether this is sustainable in the long run. because I don't believe the Chinese will have only, they will keep doing what they're doing, because if they keep doing what they're doing, they're basically America's head servant. That's what they are at the moment. But I don't think they'll continue doing what they're doing. If China, already you have a big middle class in China. Already you have around 250 million middle class. If the Chinese start introducing stimulus, in domestic demand, if they start stimulating domestic demand, and then all this money that they invest in treasury bills and so on, they will invest in China, they will pursue a proper Keynesian. Yes, then they will have their own market, then will have high wages, and they will consume internally, domestically, rather than sending all of their products outside China. So this will be a major blow to the United States. So Walmart will disappear. I mean, cheap stuff. You go to Walmart and you buy 10 socks for $50. 10 socks. I mean, if you go here to buy socks, they're very expensive.
And what about the defense industry?
Okay, again, it's all related to economic power. If these things happen, you may have war. The United States may not give up on its global hegemony peacefully. That is another contingency. I mean, I don't want to make.
But they don't need to start war, but they only need to build an atmosphere where countries are
or you can have an episode. You can have.
See Saudi Arabia is buying by billions of dollars weapons from the United States, and then another country buys an equivalent weapon, and they develop another one.
Yes. Yeah.
Other questions? Yeah.
Two questions. The first is, that recently Chinese netizens are really afraid that the QE3 that will affecting China's economy. The QE3 is the third round, that's launched by U.S. Federal Reserve this September. So it is said the Americans want to take this action to control the inflation and bring the joblessness to the reasonable level. But so to what extent do you think that QE3 will affect Chinese economy and other Asian countries?
Yeah, I want to understand the question well. To what extent what?
Well, the QE3, the third round quantitative
the quantitative easing.
Will affect China and other Asian countries. And the second question is about Japan and America. I want to ask if the Okinawa military base is the biggest issue between Japan and America.
Yes. I mean, now you gave me, this is the directly what kind of instruments the United States have still to get out of the crisis. Coming to the question the gentleman asked earlier on, they will find instruments. One of the instruments is the quantitative easing. Quantitative easing, one of the things it produced, and you will be surprised by that, is food inflation. And one of the reasons you had the Arab Spring, because food in the Arab world were massively high, the price of food price in the Western world. And nobody talks about the political economy of the Arab Spring. But there's a lot of economics in the Arab Spring. Nobody talks about. I mean, this is about this, is about that, this is about authoritarian and so on. So yes, the U.S. have the power of the dollar. If they throw massively dollars into the market, this can inflate the global economy. This can inflate massively. This is a major problem for the rest of the world. U.S., Japan, and Okinawa. Yes, it's a major issue. I mean, Japan doesn't want anymore. Even the Japanese Prime Minister made some hints a few months ago, but Obama is not moving. Said the bases in Okinawa are as important as a bread and butter issue for the United States in the Pacific. I mean, it's not going to go from Okinawa unless if something happens, and so on. Again, my position on the power shift is that it's not this happening now in front of us, it's protracted and long. How many decades it took for the British Empire to give in? And it was a small state. England is a small island, Britain is a small island. How many decades? In 1899, Leo Trotsky wrote an essay about the decline of the British Empire. He was a prophet. Leo Trotsky wrote that. You can find it on the internet. You know, it's interesting. He's a Marxist, Trotskyist. Doesn't make any difference. This guy said the British Empire is in decline. Amazing, isn't it? Well, now we're saying that the US is an empire, is in decline. The US empire is in decline. Because it's huge, yeah, it's not like Britain. It may take 200-300 years. We don't know yet, okay? But there are elements there which I think I presented that it is in fact in decline.
Other questions? Don't have time. Yes?
I will make those 2 points. China, with this new leadership, there's been a debate about changing the education so that they can be the innovative, and they can produce original thought and to the marketplace, such as Microsoft sort of things. How would you see that as impacting on US? And the second one, US surely needs to also catch up with China when it comes to Africa, because China are doing well with Africa.
Pick up some more questions. So,
Yeah?
yeah, pick up some more questions. So we can answer them all together.
No, we have time.
Okay, oh, we have time.
Yeah.
Okay. The first question is the Chinese leadership inside, if there's going to be any change.
To the sort of education system, to change their income.
I don't know. I mean, I have students writing their MA dissertations about that, so I'm looking forward to read this and learn from that. I mean, I really don't know. But the other issue about Africa is not only in Africa. There's a global competition between US and Chinese companies all over the globe, everywhere. Textiles in Latin America, textiles. The Chinese dominated the textile industry in Latin America. They dislocated all other industries, including the Greeks. They had the Chinese bought the Greek shipyards now cheaply, shipyards, and they beat the American companies and German companies. So there is a global competition. There is no question about that. Yeah.
Panama Canal is now under
Panama Canal. Yes. So this did not exist before. That's my point. Yeah. Who could ever imagine that Chinese companies will have a stakes in how you call this audit company in Stanley Morgan? They have big stakes in Stanley Morgan, the Chinese. You know that.
Just I'm going to use my power as chair of this to make a point. Last year, China put on the sea, inaugurated its first air carrier, which is very important within the geopolitics because air carrier is what allows you to project military power way beyond your borders. Times, the magazine Time came with a fantastic cartoon and 2 Chinese generals talking to each other, and the air carrier was coming to the sea, and they saw the name, and how did you name it? And he says, USS Walmart. We owe it to them. However, looking at that cartoon, I thought, well, the United States really, in a way, doesn't need any more air carriers. Okay, military powers is key, but they can project their power, and they have been projected their power and influence in other interesting ways, what Joseph and I call soft power, the projection of soft power. In fact, Hollywood, you could say, the production of the imaginary of Hollywood can be as powerful as, or as Napoleon said, a headline in a newspaper can be more powerful than 100 armies. What would you say about that?
Yes, so the soft power is still, but what is another one? Bollywood? Bollywood. Yes, soft power is very important. In fact, there is a number of liberal globalizers, IR theorists, not only theorists. I mean, Joseph Nye was also National Security Council number 2. I mean, so it's also a policymaker. It's a very important figure, a Harvard University professor, who writes about soft power. That still the United States is a major force in that respect. But by soft power, Joseph Nye also means the power to negotiate, to use diplomatic means before you decide to go to war. This, in my view, is an element of weakness in many respects. It doesn't go. It does not. It does. So Nye, Joseph Nye suggests that U.S. policymakers should be very kind of collegial with other when they discuss, when they sit down with the Russians, with the Chinese, with the Germans to discuss matters of war and peace, and not just go and bomb Kosovo or Belgrade, over Kosovo, the Kosovo affair, or go and drop bombs or go into Iraq without having the consensus of the rest of the international community. So therefore, it kind of recognizes it from behind the scenes and puts from the back door the weakness of the USA to impose its will on various populations. In that respect, what you said is very interesting to see the way in which Israel is acting. Israel is a real sovereign. If you want my opinion, Israel is the real sovereign. Not asking anybody, accountable to nobody. It drops a plane, it rigs the thing, it bombs and kills the Hamas leader. The United States cannot do that. The United States at least must go to the US Security Council and say, guys, let's agree and do something about Syria or Libya or something. You see, the Germans may say no, the Russians will say no, the Chinese will say no. At the end of the day, after 6 months, the United States may enter Iraq. And no one really will oppose the United States, militarily that is. Okay? They may have said no in the UN Security Council, but neither France, nor Germany, nor Russia, nor the Chinese opposed militarily U.S. invasion of Iraq.
Bin Laden, no?
How long did that take?
I mean, that was a declared, but that is not comparison really. I mean, this was a global. That was it was wanted. It was wanted. It was like when we're gonna get him, and this is obscure. This is very obscure. They may knew where it is. I mean, I had a friend. It was not you. That was saying that Bin Laden is on holidays. He's in Miami Beach. He's having holidays in Miami. Everybody. It wasn't you. But but Israel is different. Now, anybody lift a finger about Israel? What's going on there?
But the situation of Israel is different.
One question for
But you could argue that the US use of drones over Pakistan is the same as Israel using airstrikes in Gaza. It's an area that they're just choosing to use military force. They have no mandate there. They're invading another country's sovereignty.
There was cooperation with the Pakistani government until the Pakistani were killed. But actually, despite of what said, the US was unable for a long time to increase their operation in Afghanistan because the Pakistanis closed their and Turkey limited their ability to transport their logistics there. So, I mean, I think you have a good point, but I think it's a completely different matter. These are very small planes that direct targeting assassination. I think what Vassilis is pointing out is huge military campaigns, actually Israel uses F-16 and perform this attack and is accountable to nobody.
Well, they have US as protectors, though, don't they?
That's why they're able, I think, for that.
Or the other way around.
Or the other way around. What they don't.